The bank statement was still open on my laptop when my mother called to ask if I could help out one more time. My name is Maren. I'm 34, and for the last 6 years I've been the person my family calls when something breaks: a car, a roof, a marriage, a mortgage payment. I work as a marketing coordinator for a mid-sized healthcare logistics company in Dayton, Ohio, the kind of job that pays well enough that people assume you have more than you actually do. That assumption has followed me my whole adult life, and it followed me into this story long before I understood what it was costing me. The apartment was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the tap of rain starting against the window early April, the kind of gray Ohio spring that makes everything feel unfinished. I was sitting at my kitchen table, a mug of tea gone cold beside my laptop, when I clicked into the wrong tab by accident. Instead of the receipt I was looking for, I found myself staring at the shared account I kept with my parents, the one they'd insisted on setting up for emergencies back when I was 28 and had finally saved enough to make an emergency worth planning for. A number sat there that didn't match anything I remembered agreeing to. 5 digits. A comma in the wrong place, or so it felt. That was the moment my phone rang, my mother's name lighting the screen like it had been waiting for exactly this. "It's just for a few weeks," she said, the way she always said it, the sentence worn smooth from use. "Your father's account is tied up with the refinance. You know how banks are." I didn't know how banks are, actually. 3 days earlier, on an instinct I still can't fully explain, I'd logged into that account and found a figure that didn't line up with the small transfer I remembered making: $400 toward my mother's dental work the previous winter. I didn't say anything about it yet. I told myself I needed to understand it first, that there was probably an explanation, that jumping to conclusions about my own parents was the kind of thing that happened in other people's families, not mine. I'd come to understand much later, the first real mistake of everything that followed, not the discovery, but the quiet I wrapped around it. "How much this time?" I asked, and heard the particular held-breath quiet that always came before she named a number large enough to make me flinch. 6,000. Maybe 7. "It's temporary, Maren. You know that." I said yes. I always said yes. I want you to understand that about me before anything else, because it matters for everything that comes after. I wasn't naive, and I wasn't stupid. I had a finance degree I barely used professionally, a retirement account I contributed to with real discipline, a personal spreadsheet my friends found either impressive or slightly alarming. I understood money. What I didn't understand yet, not at 34, with a childhood full of birthday cards signed to our responsible girl, "We don't know what we'd do without you," was that being good with money doesn't protect you from people who are good at asking for it. I was the daughter who had learned, over 3 decades, that love in my family was measured in what you were willing to give up for it. My mother used to tell people, at holidays and church functions, that I was the responsible one, delivered with a warmth that made something in my chest loosen every time. I let that become the only shape I knew how to take. If you've ever built your sense of belonging around being the person no one has to worry about, you already know how easily that turns into being the person no one checks on. I hung up and sat for a long moment in the gray light, listening to the rain pick up, watching the cursor blink on the still open statement. Then I did something I'd never done in 6 years of these calls. I didn't transfer the money right away. I closed the laptop, made dinner, and sat with the unfamiliar discomfort of not yet for the first time I could remember. You should understand what this family looked like from the outside before any of this started, or the loss won't mean what it's supposed to mean. My parents, Robert and Diane Ashcroft, had been married 39 years that spring. My father ran a small contracting business he'd built from nothing in his 20s, respected work that gave him a specific pride he never learned to express any other way. My mother spent most of her adult life orchestrating the emotional architecture of our family, remembering every birthday, managing every small crisis, the center of gravity the rest of us arranged ourselves around. There was a version of my childhood that was genuinely warm. I don't say that to soften what comes later. I say it because it's true, and because both things can be true at once, that something real existed here, and that it doesn't cancel out what happened to it. I was the one who held things together, even as a kid. When my parents fought quietly, The way people fight when they've decided the marriage matters more than the argument. I noticed first, learned to read the temperature of a room, found small ways to redirect a tense dinner before it became something worse. My sister Kayla, 5 years younger, never developed that radar. She got to be the easy one, the funny one, the one who never had to read a room before walking into it. I don't resent her for that anymore. I did for a while, without quite admitting it to myself. That night, after dinner, after the dishes were done and the apartment had gone dark except for the lamp beside my reading chair, I opened my laptop again. I told myself I'd just look once more, confirm the number, understand the shape of it before I let myself feel anything. Picture it the way it actually happened. A woman in flannel pants, hair pulled back, chamomile tea going cold on the side table, scrolling through months of transaction history with the calm of someone who doesn't yet know she's about to lose that calm entirely. The transfers weren't hidden exactly, and that was the strange part. They weren't disguised under vague labels or split into smaller amounts the way you'd expect if someone were actively trying to conceal them. They were just there, 300 here, 500 there, a jump to 1,100 in October, I vaguely remembered as helping with the holidays. It was only when I forced myself to add them instead of absorbing each one as its own small, forgivable request that the total made my stomach drop. I didn't have the full number yet. I only had enough to know that whatever explanation was coming, and I fully expected one, because that was still the story I told myself about my own parents, wasn't going to fully account for what I was looking at. I lay in bed a long time that night, listening to the rain, running through a dozen benign scenarios, trying each on like a coat that didn't quite fit. Maybe there'd been an emergency they were protecting me from out of pride. Maybe the numbers meant something different than they looked like they meant. If you've ever caught yourself building an entire defense for someone before they've even been accused of anything, you already know exactly the kind of night I had. The next morning, I went to work like nothing had happened, a skill I'd perfected without ever deciding to learn it, carrying something enormous and private through an entirely ordinary day. My coworker Priya asked if I wanted lunch, and I said yes, and we talked about her upcoming trip to Portland, and not once did I mention that I'd spent the previous evening discovering my parents' finances didn't add up the way I'd always assumed. I called my mother back 2 days later, not to confront her, confrontation wasn't remotely within reach for me yet, but to ask, as gently as I knew how, if we could go over the numbers together sometime. I remember how carefully I'd rehearsed that phrasing in the shower that morning, softening every possible edge so it would land as care rather than suspicion. "Of course, honey, whenever you want," she said, so lightly that for a moment I almost believed I'd imagined the whole thing. We didn't schedule anything. 2 weeks passed. I told myself I was giving her space to bring it up first. What I was actually doing, I understand now, was giving the discomfort somewhere to live besides directly in front of me. I went to Sunday dinner twice during those weeks, and both times I watched my father more closely than usual, the way he changed the subject whenever money came up, the way he laughed once, oddly, in the middle of a sentence about the roof. A laugh that didn't belong there and vanished as fast as it appeared, like he'd startled himself with it. I noticed. And then I did what I'd always done with things that felt wrong in my family, filed it under probably nothing, passed the potatoes, asked my mother about her garden. I want to be honest about something that doesn't make me look particularly good. Part of me didn't want to look closer, because looking closer meant becoming a different kind of daughter than the one I'd spent my whole life being. If I found what I was afraid I'd find, I'd have to stop quietly handling things. I'd have to become someone who asked hard questions at dinner tables, who made people uncomfortable, who risked the version of family we'd all silently agreed to perform. I wasn't ready yet. I don't think anyone ever really is, until the choice gets made for you. 11 days after that first phone call, I sat down with the shared account again, this time with a legal pad beside my laptop, and did something I should have done from the start, wrote down every transfer I could find, going back as far as the history allowed, refusing to let myself absorb any single number without recording it first. It took most of a Saturday. Sunlight came through the kitchen window in long yellow bars, landing on a legal pad slowly filling with a story I didn't want to be reading. By 4 in the afternoon, I had a column of 41 transfers spanning over a year, and a total at the bottom I circled twice, as if circling it might change what it said. It wasn't the full number I'd eventually uncover. That was still buried under forged documents and withdrawals I didn't know existed yet. But it was enough to tell me that 6,000, maybe 7, temporary, wasn't an accurate description of anything that had actually been happening in that account. I didn't cry, which surprised me. What I felt instead was quieter and stranger, the sensation of a floor tilting slightly under a piece of furniture I'd always assumed was level. Nothing had actually changed in that moment. My parents were the same people they'd been that morning. But the ground I'd been standing on with them had just revealed itself to be at a different angle than I'd believed, and I didn't yet know how far the tilt went. If you've ever discovered, in one ordinary afternoon, that a story you'd told yourself your whole life was quietly untrue, you already know how strange the silence afterward can feel. Not devastating yet. Just wrong, in a way that hums under everything else you do for the rest of the day. I put the legal pad in the bottom drawer of my desk that night, under a folder of old tax documents, as if hiding it from myself might buy a little more time before I had to become the person who knew what I now knew. I didn't know it yet, but the legal pad in that drawer wasn't the last thing I'd find that spring. It was only the beginning of a much longer accounting, one that would eventually include a signature that wasn't mine, an inheritance that never arrived, and a sister who already knew more than she was letting on. I just hadn't started asking the right questions yet. I was about to. 2 weeks after I found the legal pad's worth of numbers I couldn't unsee, I sat across from my sister Kayla at the same diner we'd been going to since we were teenagers, and I watched her avoid my eyes in a way she never used to. Kayla is 29, works in medical billing across town, and has spent most of her adult life as the family's second favorite, close enough to matter, far enough away from the responsibility that always seemed to land on me instead. We used to be close, the kind of close where silence between us never felt uncomfortable, where we could sit in a car for 20 minutes without either of us reaching for the radio. That day, the silence had edges I wasn't used to feeling from her. "Mom mentioned you asked about the account," she said, stirring her coffee longer than coffee needs stirring, watching the spoon instead of me. I hadn't told her that. I'd told my mother once, carefully, that I wanted to go over the numbers together sometime. That was the entire sentence. That Kayla already had a version of that conversation sitting in her head before I'd said a word to her directly sat wrong in a way I noticed and, true to form, chose not to examine too closely. "I just want to understand where things stand," I said. "That's all it is." "You always want to understand everything," she said, and there was something underneath it that wasn't quite a joke, a small blade folded inside the ordinary sisterly teasing we'd been doing our whole lives. I let it go. That was the pattern by then. I let things go the way people let go of rope, hand over hand, telling themselves they still have hold of it even as the distance between their palm and the end keeps growing. The waitress refilled our coffee and Kayla asked about my upcoming work trip, and for 20 minutes we talked about nothing that mattered, the way families do when everyone in the room has silently agreed the real conversation isn't happening today. My father called 2 days later, his voice doing the warm, effortful thing it always did whenever money was the subject, a register slightly higher than normal, a pace slightly faster, sentences that circled the actual point without landing on it. He talked about the refinance again. He talked about a contractor bill for the roof that had come in higher than expected. He talked about how tight things had been since the market shifted. He never once said the word debt. He never once said an actual number. I noticed, the way you notice a smell before you can name it, that he was talking faster than usual. That he laughed once, oddly, mid-sentence about the roof, a laugh that didn't belong there, that landed and vanished as quickly as it appeared, like he'd startled himself with it. I filed it away, the way I'd started filing everything away that spring, in a growing folder of things that didn't quite fit but weren't yet worth the cost of asking about directly. I want to stop here for a second. If you've ever loved people so instinctively that you built your entire sense of safety around being useful to them, you already know what it feels like to stand at the edge of a truth you're not ready to hold. How your body knows before your mind will let you say it out loud. My hands started doing something strange that week. Whenever I opened my banking app, a small, involuntary tightening across my knuckles, like my body had started keeping a ledger my mind wasn't ready to read yet. I told myself it was stress from a work deadline. I told myself a lot of things that spring, most of them technically defensible, none of them actually true. Work became the place I want to be someone uncomplicated. I answered emails. I sat through a marketing meeting about a campaign timeline and contributed 2 reasonable suggestions. I smiled at my coworkers and ate lunch at my desk most days, telling myself I was just being efficient, when really, I think I was avoiding the particular kind of quiet that came with eating alone in the break room, where my mind had too much room to wander back to a legal pad in a bottom drawer. Kayla and I didn't talk again for almost 2 weeks after that diner lunch. When she finally called, it was about something unrelated, our cousin's baby shower, whether I was bringing a +1, whether I thought Aunt Louise would make her infamous 7-layer dip again. I answered every question. I laughed at the right places. And the entire time, underneath the ordinary rhythm of a call between sisters, I kept circling back to the 2-second pause she'd taken at the diner before saying, "Why would I know anything about that?" A pause I hadn't consciously registered until I was replaying the conversation days later, unable to sleep, staring at the ceiling of my bedroom while rain moved across the roof in waves. That was the week I started sleeping badly for the first time. Not dramatically, I wasn't lying awake sobbing or pacing the apartment. It was quieter than that, more insidious, falling asleep fine, and then waking at 2, 3, sometimes 4 in the morning, mind immediately and fully awake, running the same loop of numbers and half-remembered phone calls until exhaustion finally pulled me back under an hour or 2 before my alarm. I started drinking more coffee than usual. I started noticing, with a kind of distant clinical interest, that I was becoming a person who ran on less sleep and more caffeine and didn't examine why too closely. I went back to my parents' house for dinner on a Thursday unannounced, using the excuse that I was in the neighborhood, a lie so thin my mother could have seen through it from the driveway, though if she did, she never let on. My father was in the garage when I arrived, and I stood in the doorway for a moment before he noticed me, watching him organize tools on a pegboard with a precision that felt almost frantic, more focused than the task required. When he saw me, he startled, actually startled, dropping a wrench that clattered against the concrete floor, and then laughed too quickly to cover it, the same misplaced laugh from the phone call weeks earlier. "Didn't hear you come in," he said, picking up the wrench, not quite meeting my eyes. I told myself he was just surprised. Fathers get surprised. It didn't need to mean anything. Inside, my mother was at the stove, and the kitchen smelled like the pot roast she'd made every Thursday of my childhood, a smell so specifically tied to safety that some part of me relaxed the moment I walked in. The way your body sometimes trusts a familiar room more than it trusts what your mind already half knows. We ate at the same table I'd eaten at my whole life, under the same light fixture, and for most of the meal it felt like nothing had changed at all. My mother telling a story about a neighbor's dog, my father asking about work. Ordinary and warm in a way that made the legal pad in my desk drawer feel, for an hour, almost imaginary. Then, near the end of the meal, my mother mentioned, casually, refilling my water glass without looking at me, that she and my father had been talking to a financial advisor about restructuring some things, and that it might mean some changes to how the family handles money going forward. She said it lightly, the way you'd mention a change in dentists, and I remember the specific way my stomach dropped, because it was the first time either of them had acknowledged, even obliquely, that something about the current arrangement wasn't working the way it was supposed to. "What kind of changes?" I asked, keeping my voice as light as hers. "Oh, nothing you need to worry about," she said, and reached over to pat my hand, a gesture she'd been making my whole life to signal that a conversation was over whether I was ready for it to be or not. "You worry too much, honey. You always have." I didn't push. I want to be honest that this became a pattern I repeated more times than I'm proud of during those weeks, reaching the edge of a real question and then, at the last possible second, letting my mother's practiced deflection carry me back to safer ground. Some part of me was grateful for the deflection, even as another part of me recognized it distantly as exactly what it was. I drove home that night with the radio off, replaying the dinner in pieces, my father's startled wrench, the financial advisor mentioned, and then waved away, my mother's hand on mine. None of it was proof of anything specific. All of it, taken together, sat in my chest like a stone I couldn't quite name the shape of. I called Kayla again the following week, this time with something closer to an actual question in mind, though I still didn't ask it directly. I asked whether she'd talked to Mom and Dad about the financial advisor thing. There was that same pause again, shorter this time, but unmistakable once I knew to listen for it. "I don't really keep up with their finances," she said. "Why would I?" It was a reasonable answer. It was also, I was starting to understand, not quite a real one, the kind of sentence that answers the question you asked while carefully avoiding the one underneath it. I didn't call her out on it. I told myself, again, that I was giving her the benefit of the doubt, the same story I'd been telling myself about everyone in this family for weeks. "Why would I know anything about that?" she said. Too fast. Too even. I didn't push. That was the mistake I'd carry the longest, not the not knowing, but the choosing in that exact moment. Not to ask the second question that would have forced her to actually lie to my face instead of just deflecting around the edges of a truth she was clearly holding. I told myself I was giving her the benefit of the doubt. I was giving myself one more week of not having to be right about something I already knew. I didn't tell my parents what I'd found either. Not yet. I photographed the application on my phone before I left the credit union, a decision I made almost without thinking, the way you grab an umbrella before you're sure it's going to rain, and then I put it away and didn't look at it again for 6 days. Those 6 days were some of the strangest of my adult life. I went to work. I ran a client call that went well. I went to a friend's birthday dinner and laughed at appropriate moments and ordered a cocktail I didn't really taste. On the outside, I was a completely functional woman handling an entirely ordinary week. On the inside, I was carrying a photograph of a forged signature like a stone in my coat pocket, aware of its weight every single time I reached for my keys or my phone. I started noticing things about my own behavior that unsettled me a little. I found myself over-explaining small decisions to coworkers, why I'd chosen a particular font for a slide deck, why I preferred one meeting time over another, as though some part of me had started rehearsing justification for things that didn't need justifying, bracing for a scrutiny that hadn't actually arrived yet. I caught myself doing it in a meeting on Thursday and had to stop mid-sentence, aware suddenly of how strange I must have sounded, and I made a joke to cover it, and everyone laughed, and I went back to my desk afterward and sat very still for a few minutes, unsure what to do with the discomfort of having noticed myself so clearly from the outside. On the 4th of those 6 days, my mother called, unprompted, to ask how I was doing, a check-in that wasn't unusual on its own, except for the particular careful brightness in her voice. The sense that she was working slightly too hard to sound like this was an ordinary call. We talked for 12 minutes about nothing in particular. Near the end, almost as an afterthought, she mentioned that Kayla had said I'd been asking a lot of questions lately, and asked, lightly, whether everything was all right. I said everything was fine. I said I was just being thorough about my own finances, that it had nothing to do with anyone else. I heard how flat and rehearsed the sentence sounded even as I said it, and I think she heard it too, because there was a small pause on her end before she said, "Okay, honey. You know we're always here if you want to talk," in a tone that somehow made talk sound like a threat neither of us was ready to name directly. I hung up and sat with my phone in my hand for a long time, feeling the particular vertigo of realizing that my own family was now watching me the same careful way I'd been watching them, that whatever this was, it was no longer a private discovery I was quietly sitting on. It had become something mutual, something both sides were circling without naming, and the not naming of it had started to feel less like caution and more like a shared performance neither of us could figure out how to stop. If I had asked Kayla the second question that night at my apartment instead of 6 days later, I think everything that followed would have unfolded differently. I don't know if it would have unfolded better, but it would have been different, and some nights that's the distinction that keeps me up. On the 6th day, I finally opened the photograph again. I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop, cross-referencing the forged application against the transaction history I'd been quietly compiling for weeks, and I began to understand, for the first time with real precision, that this wasn't a single lapse in judgment. It was a system. The forged application had opened a credit line that fed directly into the shared account, a line I hadn't known existed until that afternoon, a line whose monthly minimum payments had themselves been drawn from money that, as far as I could tell, was never intended to be mine to lose. I didn't confront anyone that week. I told myself I needed more information before I said anything I couldn't take back, a reasonable instinct in theory, though I understood even then that it was also serving as a very convenient excuse to keep postponing a conversation I was afraid of having. I started a new folder on my laptop, this one carefully organized, named only with a date so it wouldn't draw attention if anyone else ever opened my computer. Into it went the photograph of the forged application, screenshots of the transaction history, a running list of dates and amounts that I updated most evenings after dinner, sitting at the same kitchen table where this had all started weeks earlier. There's a particular kind of loneliness in gathering evidence against your own family. No one teaches you how to do it. There's no framework, no script, nothing that tells you how to sit across from your mother at Sunday dinner with a forged document sitting in a folder on your laptop at home and still pass her the potatoes, and still laugh at your father's joke about the neighbor's new fence, and still hug them both goodbye at the door with the same warmth you'd always shown, because the alternative, showing your hand before you were ready, felt more dangerous than the deception itself. I went back to the credit union near the end of that stretch, this time asking, under the guise of double-checking something for my taxes, for a full printout of every account linked to my name in any capacity. The same clerk helped me, not recognizing me from before, cheerfully unaware that she was handing over the second and third pieces of a puzzle I was assembling in complete privacy. There were 2 more documents with my name on them that I hadn't known about, a smaller personal loan from 18 months earlier, and a credit card opened in my name that had never once been mentioned to me, its statements apparently redirected to an address I didn't recognize until I realized, with a fresh cold drop in my stomach, that it was my parents' old post office box, the one they'd kept for years for reasons I'd never questioned. I sat in my car in the credit union parking lot for the second time in 2 weeks, staring at documents that made the earlier discovery look almost modest by comparison. This wasn't a temporary shortfall covered by a well-meaning but overwhelmed family. This was a structure, built carefully, maintained deliberately, across more time than I'd initially imagined. I didn't cry in that parking lot either. I think by then I'd moved past the stage where crying felt like the right response. What I felt instead was a strange, focused clarity, the kind that arrives after enough shock has worn a person down to something harder and more precise underneath. I drove home and, for the first time since this had all started, I didn't put the new documents away in a drawer. I added them to the folder immediately, dated them, and sat with the growing weight of what I now understood I was actually looking at. I still didn't say anything to my parents. Not that week. But something had shifted in me by the time I closed my laptop that night, a decision I hadn't consciously made, but recognized once it had already settled into place. I was no longer trying to understand what had happened so I could forgive it more easily. I was building a record because some part of me had already accepted that forgiveness, whatever that word would eventually mean here, wasn't going to be the first thing this required. If you've ever spent weeks being kind to people while quietly building the case that would eventually end that kindness, you already know how strange that particular double life feels from the inside. How normal you can appear while something enormous is rearranging itself underneath. By the time I sat down with the full picture, I had 11 documents, 3 months of transaction histories, and a headache that had lived behind my left eye for the better part of a week. Sleep had become something that happened to other people. I'd lie in bed running numbers I already knew by heart, doing the math over and over as if repetition might somehow change the total. $92,000. That was the figure once I'd traced every transfer, every forged application, every small unauthorized withdrawal going back nearly 2 years, further back than I'd ever suspected, further back than the temporary story my mother kept repeating could possibly explain. I found out about the true timeline in the most mundane way possible, a customer service call I made pretending to be resolving a duplicate account issue, reading off the shared account's full history to a patient representative whose name, absurdly, was also Diane, which felt like a joke my life was playing on me at the worst possible moment. The account hadn't gone tight because of a refinance. It had gone tight because it had been steadily drained since before my grandmother died, since before her will was even read. That detail sat differently than the others. My grandmother had left something to each of us grandchildren, a modest inheritance she'd been proud of, something she'd talked about openly in her last years as her way of making sure we each had a little something of our own. I never saw mine arrive. I'd assumed, when I hadn't heard anything about it after the funeral, that it had simply been smaller than expected, or delayed in the way estates are sometimes delayed. And I'd let the assumption sit unquestioned because questioning it felt disrespectful to my grandmother's memory. Now I understood it had likely gone straight into the same account everything else had been quietly disappearing into. I didn't confront anyone. Not yet. I photographed the full transaction history, printed the forged application and the 2 additional documents from the credit union, and organized everything into a single folder, backed up in 2 places, following an instinct toward caution that felt, by then, less like paranoia and more like basic self-preservation. I told myself I was being careful. Some nights I told myself I was being a coward, and I let both of those things be true at once. My appetite went next. I'd stand in front of my open refrigerator at 11 at night, look at food I'd bought and forgotten about, and close the door without taking anything out. My coworker Priya asked me twice in 1 week if I was feeling all right, and both times I said I was just tired, which was true in the way half-truths are always technically true. There was a night, close to the end of that stretch, when I almost called my mother and told her everything I knew. I had the phone in my hand. I'd typed the first sentence in my head a dozen times, rearranging the words, trying to find a version that wouldn't detonate everything the moment it left my mouth. And then I thought about what would actually happen the instant I said it out loud, that there would be no way to unknow it together afterward, that some part of our relationship would end the second I spoke, and I put the phone down instead, and sat on the edge of my bed for a long time in the dark. I want to stop here for a second, because I think some of you already know this particular kind of paralysis. It isn't fear of the truth. It's fear of what the truth will cost you to finally say out loud, to a room, to the people who taught you what love was supposed to look like in the first place. Around this time, the silent ace sat in my possession without my acting on it. I had, by then, one final piece I hadn't told anyone about, a recorded voicemail from my father, left by accident weeks earlier when he'd apparently meant to call my mother and misdialed, in which he referenced covering the gap before Maren notices, in a tone so casual it made my skin go cold the first time I listened to it. I played it exactly once. I didn't send it to anyone. I didn't mention it to Kayla or confront my father with it. I put it in the folder, dated it, and closed the laptop, telling myself I was saving it, though for what, exactly, I couldn't yet have said out loud. Some part of me understood, even then, that I was holding it in reserve the way you hold something you're not yet ready to use, because using it would mean there was no version of this conversation left where I could still pretend I might be wrong. I saw my father twice during that stretch, both times at ordinary family occasions where nothing was said and everything was noticed. At my cousin's engagement party, I watched him avoid standing near me for most of the evening, an avoidance so smooth and practiced that I doubt anyone else in the room registered it at all. I registered it. I filed it away with everything else, another small behavioral thread in a pattern that had, by then, become impossible to read any other way. My mother, in contrast, seemed to be leaning harder into warmth than usual, calling more frequently, complimenting things about my life she'd never commented on before, sending a card, just because. That arrived the same week I'd requested the credit union's full account history. I don't think it was calculated, not consciously. I think, looking back, it was closer to instinct, the same instinct that had let her forge my signature in the first place, a deep, practiced need to manage the emotional temperature of every room she was in, even a room she couldn't fully see. Even a daughter 3 miles away quietly assembling proof against her. I put the folder back in its place on my laptop, unopened, unmentioned, for 11 more days. I told myself I was waiting for the right moment. I know now I was waiting for a moment that would never arrive on its own. I was going to have to make it happen, and some part of me wasn't ready to be the one who broke something that, from the outside, had always looked like love. If you've ever smiled and nodded through a family dinner while something inside you had already quietly ended, you know exactly what that month felt like. I didn't know it yet, but I wouldn't be the one who chose when this finally came apart. Something else was about to do that for me, 3 weeks sooner than I planned, in front of people I never intended to have in the room. It happened at my father's 60th birthday dinner, in my parents' dining room, with 12 people at the table and a caterer's leftover trays still warm on the counter. I hadn't planned to bring the folder. I want to be honest about that. I came that night intending only to get through dinner, smile through the toast, and figure out my next move later on my own terms, in private. What changed things was Kayla. She'd had 2 glasses of wine and was telling my Aunt Louise a story about the credit union, laughing, careless, the way you laugh about something you've stopped being afraid of because enough time has passed. You should have seen Maren's face when she found out about the loan thing, she said, not realizing or not caring that I was seated 4 feet away. I thought she was going to lose it. The table went quiet in the particular way a room goes quiet when it senses it has just crossed into something it wasn't supposed to touch. My mother's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. My father's laugh, that same startled, misplaced laugh I'd heard on the phone months earlier, came out again, thinner this time, and died fast. I didn't plan what happened next. I want that understood clearly, because I've turned it over in my mind since, and I still don't fully recognize the version of myself who stood up. I named every wrong thing they had done to me. Not loudly at first, my voice came out steadier than I expected, almost calm, which surprised me as much as anyone. The forged signature. The credit line opened in my name. The credit card I'd never known existed. The $92,000. My grandmother's inheritance that never reached my account. I said the number out loud, and I watched my mother's face do something I'd never seen it do before. Not shame, not yet. Calculation. You have no idea what we've been through, my mother said, and her voice sharpened into something familiar and terrible. You want to sit there and act like the victim. After everything we've sacrificed for you, do you know what it cost us to raise you, to keep this family together while you were off building your career and barely calling? You've always thought you were better than us because you had money and we didn't. This is what that looks like from where we're sitting. It landed exactly where she meant it to. Some part of it, the guilt about missed calls, the old story about being the responsible one who'd somehow also grown distant, had enough truth folded into it to make my chest tighten. For one terrible second, I felt the ground shift under the thing I'd walked uncertain of. Then I remembered the forged signature, and the ground came back. You put my name on a loan application, I said. That's not a sacrifice. That's a crime, and we both know it. My father hadn't spoken. He was staring at the tablecloth. My Aunt Louise, who I had genuinely never expected to say a single word in my defense in my entire life, set down her glass and said, quietly but clearly enough for the whole table to hear, Diane. Is that true? The room did not react uniformly. My uncle looked at his plate. My cousin's kids kept eating, oblivious. Kayla went white and silent, the wine gone out of her voice entirely, and said nothing at all while my mother searched the table for an ally and found fewer than she expected. I didn't know it then. This is what my mother told me, weeks later, when there was nothing left to gain by lying. I remember standing in that dining room feeling the floor actually tilt. Everyone was looking at me the way you look at someone who's just been unmasked, and my first instinct, God help me, was to look for the fastest way to make it about her instead of me. It wasn't even a decision. It was reflex. I'd spent so many years being the one who held this family story together that turning the blame was just what my mouth knew how to do before my mind caught up. It was only afterward, alone in the kitchen doing dishes no one needed done, that I let myself feel what I'd actually done to my own daughter. And even then, it took days before I could say the word theft to myself instead of borrowed. Back in the dining room, my mother's composure cracked for the first time that night, not into tears, but into something quieter and more exposed. A long pause where she seemed to be searching for a version of the story that could still hold. "I was going to pay it back," she said finally, and her voice had lost its sharpness. "Every time I told myself I was going to pay it back." When I asked, "Before or after you forged my name on a loan I didn't know existed?" She didn't answer. My father finally looked up, and what I saw in his face wasn't defiance, it was something closer to relief, the specific relief of a secret finally being too big to carry alone anymore. "I told her it had to stop," he said quietly, to no one in particular, to the tablecloth. "I told her a dozen times." "But you signed things too," I said. "You knew. You let it happen anyway." He didn't argue with that. He didn't say anything at all. I left before dessert. I didn't slam the door. I said one sentence to my father on my way out: "You let this happen, and you never once told me the truth," and I walked to my car in the cold with my hands shaking so badly I had to sit for 2 full minutes before I could drive. I didn't cry until I was 3 blocks away. Then I cried the whole way home, and it didn't feel like weakness. It felt like something finally being allowed to leave my body after being held there for months. My mother called me 4 days later. It wasn't an apology. Not really, not the kind that costs something. It was an explanation, delivered slowly, without the sharp edges of that dinner, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I let her finish without needing to protect either of us from what she was saying. "I never meant for it to become what it became," she said. "I told myself every single time it was the last time. And then it wasn't. I don't have a way to make that not true." I didn't forgive her that day. I'm not sure I've fully forgiven her now, months later, though something has softened at the edges that I didn't expect to soften. What I did do, 2 days after that dinner, was go to a lawyer, not out of revenge, though I won't pretend there wasn't some grim satisfaction in the paperwork. I did it because a forged signature is not a family matter. It's a legal one, and pretending otherwise had already cost me nearly $100,000 and most of a year's sleep. The credit union opened its own investigation once I filed the fraud report. My parents were required to repay what could be documented under a settlement that avoided criminal charges only because I chose, in the end, not to push for them, a decision I made for myself, not for my mother. Because I didn't want the rest of my life defined by a courtroom. My father's contracting business, already strained, didn't survive the year that followed. Word travels fast in a town the size of ours, and clients who'd trusted him for 2 decades quietly stopped calling. My mother lost something harder to name, the version of herself she'd spent a lifetime building, the capable matriarch who held everyone together. That story doesn't survive being told correctly in front of witnesses. Kayla and I don't speak much anymore. She reached out once, in the fall, with a long message about how she'd only ever wanted to keep the peace, how she never thought it would go that far. I read it twice and didn't answer for 3 weeks. When I finally did, I told her the truth, that keeping someone's secret while they take from you isn't peace. It's a choice, and she made hers a long time before that dinner. I don't know if we'll ever find our way back to something resembling what we had. Some nights I miss her anyway. I moved to a smaller apartment across town that spring, not because I had to, but because I wanted a version of my life that didn't have my parents' address memorized into my hands. I still have the folder, backed up in 3 places now, a habit I don't think I'll ever fully let go of. Some habits are just what caution looks like after you've learned what happens without it. I am not the same person who sat at that kitchen table with 2 laptops open, telling herself a 5-figure gap was probably nothing. I don't say yes as fast as I used to. I ask the second question now, the one I let slide with Kayla in the diner, every single time. It has cost me a few relationships that couldn't survive the asking. I've decided I can live with that math. The last time I saw my mother, at a cousin's wedding neither of us could avoid, she looked smaller than I remembered, not physically, just diminished somehow. The way people look once the story they told about themselves has stopped being available to them. We spoke for 4 minutes. It was civil. It was not warm. I drove home afterward without crying, which felt like its own kind of ending. I don't know yet what my relationship with my parents will look like in 5 years. I've stopped needing to know. That, more than anything else, is the part of myself I'm proudest of finding again. The most painful detail in this story isn't the $92,000. It's the 6 days Maren spent sitting on a photograph of a forged signature, telling herself she was being careful when she was actually still hoping, against clear evidence, that the people who raised her hadn't actually done what the evidence already proved they'd done. That gap between knowing and acting is where this story does its real work. Maren's entire identity had been built around being useful, being the one who holds things together, and that identity didn't just make her vulnerable to being taken from, it made her slow to name it, even to herself. Because naming it meant giving up the role that had organized her whole sense of belonging in that family. Her mother's blame reversal at the dinner table worked, for one terrible second, precisely because it aimed at that exact wound, not because it was true. But because Maren had spent 30 years believing that being loved and being needed were the same transaction. What's easy to miss, watching Diane from the outside, is that her justification wasn't invented in that dining room. It had been years in the making, a slow accumulation of just this once that eventually stopped requiring permission from her own conscience. That's how most financial betrayals inside families actually happen. Rarely a single dramatic theft. Almost always a series of small borrowings that never got repaid, each one easier than the last because the first one didn't get caught. Kayla's silence is worth sitting with too. She never forged anything. She never took $1. But she knew, and she let her sister keep believing something false because the truth would have cost her something: comfort, closeness, her place as the family's easier daughter. Betrayal by omission rarely gets named as betrayal, but Maren felt the difference immediately, and she was right to. The turning point wasn't the confrontation itself, it was the moment Maren chose to file the fraud report instead of quietly asking for repayment behind closed doors. That decision moved the story out of the family's control and into a system that couldn't be talked around at a dinner table. It's also the moment her arc stopped being about being wronged and started being about what she was willing to do with that knowledge. What lingers after this story isn't really about money. It's about the specific danger of confusing usefulness with worth, and what happens to a person's judgment when the people closest to them learn, quietly, that her love comes with very few conditions attached. Which leaves the harder question sitting underneath all of it. How many of us are still handing people the benefit of the doubt they stopped earning years ago, simply because giving it feels more like ourselves than the alternative? I keep coming back to those 6 days Maren sat on a photograph she already knew the meaning of. Not because it was foolish, it wasn't, but because I think most of us have a version of that folder somewhere. A conversation we've been putting off. A number we haven't let ourselves add up. A person we keep giving one more chance to, not because we believe them, but because believing them is easier than admitting what we already know. The signs were there long before that dinner, the laugh that didn't belong, the pause on the phone that lasted 2 seconds too long, the daughter who somehow already knew what her sister hadn't been told. None of it was subtle in hindsight. It rarely is. If there's one thing worth carrying out of this story, it's that asking the second question isn't cruelty. It isn't disloyalty. Sometimes it's the only form of self-respect available to you in a room full of people who are counting on you not to ask it. Thank you for sitting with Maren's story tonight. I'll see you in the next one.